Good morning, or afternoon, evening, good night, however, whatever time you're watching this. This is our Sunday school lesson for our First at Home series for June the 14th. And our lesson this week is entitled Jesus Heals a Woman and Raises a Girl. And this is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 5. Be interesting if I had a Mark 25. You don't believe whatever I say then. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. So let's read that passage together. We're going to read the whole thing, even though in our lesson today it's going to be split up. Well, before we do that, let me read our points and then we'll read the text. Trust in Jesus' power to remove the suffering of affliction. Point number 2, trust in Jesus' power to remove the shame of impurity. And along with that one, I'm going to say in that passage, we're really looking at what makes genuine faith. What are some factors of genuine faith, or what is one factor? And that is action. Works proves genuine faith. And number 3, trust in Jesus' power to remove the curse of death. All right, so let's read our text together, and we'll probably read bits and pieces as we go along. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. Where am I? Wrong page. Makes a difference. Excuse me. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and spent all she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and in trembling, and fell down before him and told the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and healed of your disease." And while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went into where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, rise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this. And he told them to give her something to eat. So let's move on to point number 1. Okay, and point number 1, trust in Jesus' power to remove the suffering of affliction. It says Mark 5:25 through 29. All right, and we're going to kind of catch up to the story. We've already read the background passage from verse 21. Jesus is going to He's crossed onto the other side of the sea, and he's been contacted by some people from Jairus. Well, Jairus himself has come on behalf of his daughter, and he's on his way there. And the crowd is gathered to see what the great Jesus is going to do. They can't wait to see a miracle. So they're thronged around him. They're crushing in on him. And so we picked that up. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all she had, and was no better, but grew worse. So we have this woman who has a problem, and it's not a small problem, and it's not a recent development. This is something that she has struggled with for over a decade, and I'm trying to make the point that this is not a simple thing. This is not something that you could mistake. Like, Jesus healed me from my hiccups. I had the hiccups for 15 minutes, and then all of a sudden I stopped hiccuping because I looked at a picture of Jesus or something. That's not necessarily miraculous, but something that's been going on for 12 years. You've had it treated by multiple physicians, and instead of getting better, it's gotten worse. And immediately, as soon as you touch the hem of Jesus' robe, you become healed. That's significant. This is a significant healing. So let's look at it real quick. What's going on here? Well, it's a big deal because it's a nuisance. It's been going on for 12 years. And I won't go into the details about what's happening to the woman, but let's suffice it to say that she has a condition that causes her to be unclean. And if you look back at the Old Testament laws in my notebook here, my Sunday school lesson, it gives you the reference of Leviticus 15:25-27. So there's, back in the Levitical law, this sort of issue of blood was considered unclean, and so the woman could not enter into the worship area. She couldn't enter into the temple, in this case the synagogue. And what's worse maybe than that is anybody who touched her was considered unclean for several days and couldn't enter. And so this woman has been living with a condition that makes her unclean, and it also makes anybody who touches her unclean. Now, I don't mean to make light of any situation, but boy, does that not sound familiar right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, she couldn't shake hands with people. She couldn't give anybody a big hug and a kiss. And I bet just in case people stayed away, maybe 5 feet, maybe 6 feet, I don't know, away from her. But anyway, you couldn't touch her unless you would be unclean as well. And so we think it's been hard staying away from church, and it is difficult for us. But in the ancient Jewish times, the synagogue is the center of much more than just the religious life of the people. It is the social epicenter for the entire communities and regions. It's where people gather to see one another and to interact. And it's, in a lot of ways, the social structure, comes from out of the synagogue. And legal issues and personal issues are handled there, and not to mention religious issues. And religion is tied closer to life, everyday practical life in some ways in this case. There's religious ceremonies that are necessary to be carried out. And so she has been blocked from all of that for 12 years. She has been a socially distanced outcast for 12 years and tried everything. She has spent, the Bible says, all that she has. So now not only is she sick, but she's destitute. She's broke. She's nothing left. She's a social outcast that can't be touched. And she is broke. So she's in a very, very difficult and sad situation. Verse 27. She had heard the reports about Jesus. That's number one, isn't it? How do people get healing from Jesus? They have to hear of Jesus. They've got to hear the report. Somebody told her. Whether or not they told her directly at this point, it doesn't matter. She heard the reports of Jesus. So she sees the crowd gathering and she knows who's at the center of it. She came up behind him in the crowd, probably making tons of people unclean, unaware of it. They were unaware of it probably. And she reached out and touched the hem of his robe. She touched his garment. Because she said in her mind, she reasoned, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. And so I love this passage because for a lot of things, but one of the things I love about it is it's kind of weird. All right? It's just kind of weird. Nobody, well, not any Orthodox people, or anyways, are teaching you that, what you really need to be healed is go find a relic that, the robe that Jesus used to wear and touch that. And that'll make you well. Nobody is saying, well, I would love to pray for you and help you get better, but, gosh, I'm fresh out of Jesus' robe, so I guess there's nothing I can do for you. Some people do things like this. There are people who sell prayer cloths and they pray over this piece of, cotton fabric and then ship it through the United States Postal Service to your house. And supposedly it has some kind of magical power like a potion or something. That's a bunch of baloney, by the way. But even though this is not the normal prescribed way excuse me, to receive healing, Jesus heals her. And what it says to me and what it should say to you is that there is a leniency when it comes to faith. You don't have to plug in the right formula for God to answer your prayer. God is not moved by spells and incantations. He's not forced into doing something because you prayed it just right. Prayer Jabez, I said exactly what I'm supposed to say. Now, hand it over. I beat you in the spell battle or whatever. It's not some sort of fantasy novel where the wizard figures out the exact word to say and, the creature has to do what he says or something like that. God is moved by our heart and our motivation and our compassion. He's moved by our love and our repentance and our faith, not by us doing a certain thing or saying a certain thing. If somebody comes to Jesus in faith and they start to say what we all call, quote, the sinner's prayer, and they leave out a part, it doesn't mean they're not saved. That's insane. That's stupid. If you think God is that kind of a God, then you're not serving the God of the Bible. You're serving a God of your own imagination. God does not work that way. Now, had she just lofted up a prayer to the empty space and says, I don't want to face any suffering and I hope I live forever, that's not the same thing either. She had to react to truth. She heard the reports of Jesus. She's a Jewish person. She knows the scriptures. And as Paul told Timothy, hearing the scriptures can make you wise unto salvation. So I think she has enough information and she knows who Jesus is to put true saving faith into Jesus. But she didn't do it exactly the way that we prescribe to do it. Coming and bowing down to a relic or kissing the feet of a statue or touching a cloth of something or kissing the ring of somebody, it doesn't mean squat. And I think that's beautiful here because do you really think that touching the hem of his robe healed her? I don't think so. I think what happened here was it was an act of faith. It was an act of faith. And Jesus honored that. Because again, Jesus turns around in just a minute. We're going to see, he says, who touched me? Like he doesn't know. Like he's sitting there going, this has got me stumped. I mean, I can see the future. I know the past. I know where Andrew was before I saw him. I know all of these things, but this person who touched me, I just can't figure it out. No, he knows. This is rhetorical. This is for the benefit of those hearing. Kind of like when he raised Lazarus and he says, Lord, I know you hear me. I'm praying out loud so that everybody else knows what's going on. And that's what he's doing here, I believe. So her faith has made her whole. Well, we'll see that in a minute. Her faith does make her whole. Jesus pronounces that. All right, so on to point number 2. All right, back here again with point number 2. Trust in Jesus' power to remove the shame of impurity. So Mark 5:31 through 34. All right. Mark 5:30 through 34. All right. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, Who touched me? And again, I just want to reiterate here. I don't think Jesus needs to ask for who touched me. And I think probably what's going on here is he wants everybody to see what's happening, but he also wants to draw this woman out, and he's not asking out of curiosity. Gosh, I wonder who it was that touched me. Could anybody give me a name? Now he's looking into the crowd and he wants to say, Who touched me? Which one of you? And he's giving this woman a chance to come forward on her own. And we'll see if she does. And the disciple said to him, God, you see the crowd pressing in around you, yet you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. So he's looking into the crowd, waiting to see. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, she knew it was her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him. So she trusts in Jesus, but she still doesn't know what he's all about yet. She knows that he's from God. She knows that he's powerful. But she doesn't know if this is an Elisha and the she-bear kind of moment. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm about to call down some bad stuff on you for taking my power. Or if this is going to be, well, actually, I don't think she thinks it's going to be a good thing. She's terrified. She's scared. She's got healing. And she thought in the anonymity of the crowd, she could get away with this. But Jesus found her. So why else do you think the woman might be scared? Think about this. Didn't I just say a moment ago that when a person was touched by someone with this affliction, that they became ceremonially unclean? Remember that? Okay. And what has she been doing here for the past who knows how long? She has been worming her way through a crowd of Jewish people, touching all of them, not the least of which is the head of the synagogue. If there's one guy in town that doesn't need to be ceremonially unclean, it's the leader of the synagogue, Jairus. And his family is here, or his wife. His wife may be at home, but the point is, he is now ceremonially unclean, almost without a doubt. Even if he's not technically, he probably would be considered because he was in the crowd. The disciples are now unclean. And for our minds, probably worst of all, Jesus is now unclean. Why? Because Jesus has been tainted with the uncleanliness of this woman. Are you starting to see a picture here come together? Because I am, and this is a powerful passage for that reason. No one mentions, especially Jesus, the fact that she has now tainted them unclean. Now, we might say that she has gloves on or something, and so she's not touched the other people. We could assume that because nobody says anything about it. We couldn't assume it, but we could postulate that that's possible. Or her hands are somehow covered, but she touched Jesus. And I think the implication here is with her hand, and again, that's why she's scared. Because once she explains to him, hey, I've been unclean for 12 years and I just touched you. And you're about to go into the house of the leader of the synagogue. I'm sorry, I kind of ruined everything. But what happens when this unclean woman touches Jesus? Jesus does not become unclean. The woman becomes clean. Just let that sink in for a minute. This is a microcosm for how Jesus works. The unclean person passing off their sin onto him, and he passing off and declaring righteousness in place of that uncleanliness. This is how it works when you come to Jesus. He takes what's filthy and dirty about you. He takes it and he washes it. And instead he gives to you beauty for ashes. He cleans you up. And that's what he did for this woman. So, excuse me, that would have made Jesus ceremonially unclean. But because it's Jesus, it did not. And so Jesus tells her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. So, there's been a war of faith versus works in the church, it seems, since forever. And it really was heightened in the Reformation period when Martin Luther lashed out against the Catholic Church, who highlighted works. And Martin Luther lashed out with, the Reformed theology that most of us know of now, and anybody who's listening to me probably is a son or daughter of the Reformation in some way. And that is faith alone was one of the mantras of the Reformation. So much so that Luther championed the idea of faith alone that he anathematized just about an entire book of the Bible, the book of James, which just so happens Pastor Matt was preaching on last week. I don't think that's the case, but I think what he was missing in the book of James is very clear. James chapter 2, there's this whole discussion about a dead faith, a faith that can't save you. And James is saying that a faith that doesn't have works with it can't save you. And to me, it's kind of almost semantics, because I don't think he means that you can have genuine saving faith, but if you lack the works part of it, then you're unsaved. What I think James is saying clearly to me is that a genuine saving faith is two pillars. It's faith, but in the Bible, faith is not a mental thing. Faith is an act. That is why I believe in, I'm going to get caught here if I say this. I believe it's Hosea, and I think Paul quotes him when he says, we walk by faith, not by sight. It doesn't say we sit here and believe, or we sit here and think by faith. We walk by faith. Last I checked, walking was an action. I'm not a grammar expert, but I think that's a verb. We walk by faith. And that's what James is saying. And that's what this woman did in our lesson today, in the second point. She walked by faith. She acted in her faith. And you and I do the same thing. We can say we believe in Jesus, but really, James is telling us until you put that belief into practice, you can't know if you really believe into him. There's the old adage or illustration about sitting in a chair. And again, Matt used this Sunday, but it's just such a perfect analogy that I think it's worth using over and over. And that is, you can say that you believe that a chair will hold you, That's not faith. Faith is sitting in the chair. And as somebody who recently has made a porch swing, I can tell you, I made one and it fell. It just. So the second time around, when I sat in it, I did not have faith in that chair. I was slowly grabbing onto something in case it fell. And it took me a while. I realized it took me probably weeks or months before I could walk out and just plop down in that swing with faith. Up until then, it's fear and trepidation. It's like, I hope this is going to hold me. Or, I mean, it'll hold me, but I don't know if my kids need to sit on it. And now I'm like, okay, it's held me many times before. I know it will hold me today. And that's faith. And this is what the woman did. She put her belief into action. All right, point number 3, the last one today. Trust in Jesus' power to remove the curse of death. And this is Mark 35 through 36, skipping 37 and 38, and 39 through 42 for some reason. I don't know why. But anyway, let's read it together. 35. And while he was still speaking there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Again, kind of a condensed version of Jesus' theology of the gospel. Don't fear, only believe. And he allowed no one with him except Peter, James, John, the brother of James. And of course, he takes Jairus and his wife with him. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing. And then he entered and said to them, "Why are y'all making a commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Now, the reason why these people laughed at him is because they weren't really sad, most likely. And I'm taking an aside to talk about this. It's not really important, but it's one of those weird things in the Bible. And you're thinking, if my niece, at this point, my 12-year-old niece just died, I wouldn't be able to laugh at somebody who thought she was still alive. Like, that wouldn't be a funny enough joke for me to get over the horror and the tragedy. Can you hear? I don't know if you can hear that. This is my dishwasher. It literally plays an entire bar of a song when it goes off. Don't know why, but you've been treated to that. So there you go. So how are these people able to laugh at this? Well, it's most likely that they're professional mourners and weepers, in my opinion. They're being paid to weep and wail, of all things. That was a thing that people did. You know, we send flowers to a funeral and they scream. So anyway. And when he entered, he said to them, we already got there, and they laughed at him. But then he put them all outside. So he kicked their tails out of the house. And he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him. So Peter, James, and John. And they went into where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." So Jesus took her by the hand and said, "Talitha kumi," which Mark translates from Aramaic into Greek because he is writing to a Greek audience. And all of the New Testament books are written in Greek, but not all of them are written to Greeks. So in some cases, some of the writers will translate the Aramaic into Greek so that people who aren't natural Aramaic speakers can understand it. In this case, Talitha kumi is the exact word. And Mark is thought to be the disciple of Peter. And we think that this gospel was kind of dictated possibly, or passed on to Mark by Peter. So that you can imagine Peter is there. He's one of the people who's there. And he remembers Jesus reaching down and taking that little girl by the hand and saying, "Talitha, Talitha kumi." And he feels it's imperative to include that detail. But then Mark translates that. Well, that means, "Little girl, arise." And so she gets up. Verse 43, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat. So what a powerful testimony. Jesus not only heals a woman, but he also raises the dead. And he tells them not to tell anyone. And I can't help but think at this point, Jesus is not wanting to get the cart ahead of the horse. This is a religious leader. And if the leader of a synagogue comes and says, hey, I've encountered a prophet who is checking all of these boxes for Messiah, and probably the hardest one to check here, he's raising the dead and healing, then they're going to try to exalt Jesus before he needs to be, and they're going to try to put him on a political throne when he doesn't need to be there. He doesn't want to be there. He's not supposed to be there. So I think that's why in Mark's gospel there's all this secrecy. It's not to hide who Jesus is, but to delay the coming out party, really, to delay the explanation and the full discovery of who he is. There is a right time for him to explain who he is, and it's not yet. And so that's why they say that. But something I found really interesting was this story, how it plays on these two people. And we have in this story probably the two ends of the spectrum. We have a woman who is ceremonially unclean for 12 years. She is a social outcast. She is an actual outcast. She is a religious outcast. She is the lower dregs of society. She's poor, and she's sick, and she is unclean. And on the other hand, we have a guy who's the exact opposite. He is well off, and he is considered to be righteous and the leader of the synagogue. And I want you to see how Jesus heals both of these people almost simultaneously. He comes to the aid of the woman and heals her, and then he comes to the aid of Jairus and heals him. And I think the implication is, and he can heal anybody in between. And so we have this kind of well-rounding, this full circle salvation and help and healing of Jesus Christ, where he's healing the synagogue's leader, and then he's also healing the outcast from the synagogue, the one who's not even allowed in there. She's so low on the society's totem pole, so to speak. And so the implication there is that Jesus is for everyone. He's for the lowest to the highest and everyone in between. And what he offers them isn't necessarily something in this life. Did you notice in this story here, Jesus offered the woman healing, and she got her physical healing, which allows her to kind of enter back into her social and religious life. It also said that she was poor, but Jesus didn't give her any money. So Jesus coming into our lives doesn't solve all of our problems. And in this case, Jesus heals Jairus' daughter. And unless I missed something in the world, she died again. She didn't become immortal in the sense that she's never going to die. So Jesus is offering us something in this life, but more than that, he's offering us the resurrection life. The woman's faith made her heal. Jairus' faith healed his daughter. And it's all about the gospel. It's all about the end game. Jesus healed these people because he had compassion on them, but he also healed them in order to spread the gospel and make the gospel clearer to the world. Make the message of his kingdom clear, which is that this place and this existence is flawed, and it needs to be reborn. It needs to be recreated. And in Christ, we can be a part of that new creation if we but trust in him and put our faith in him.